January 17, 1942. The South China Sea. The night hung thick and black over the water, broken only by the phosphorescent glow of disturbed plankton trailing behind the merchant vessel Kokuyomaru. Captain Yamashita Kenji stood on the bridge, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the convoy of 12 ships cut through the darkness towards Singapore. The air tasted of salt and diesel fuel. Below deck, his crew slept in hammocks that swayed with the rhythm of the engine, unaware that beneath them, 40 meters down, something moved through the deep water with mechanical patience. In the silence before dawn, there was a sound, not loud, but wrong. A metallic groan that shouldn't exist in open ocean. Then the world erupted. The torpedo struck Kokuyomaru amidships with such force that men sleeping in the forward hold never woke. The explosion tore through steel plating like paper, and the vessel began its descent into darkness, taking with it 400 tons of rice, medical supplies, and replacement parts for Zero fighters stationed in Malaya. Captain Yamashita survived. He would spend the next 3 hours clinging to debris, watching the convoy scatter in panic, realizing with growing horror that the American submarine had already disappeared back into the depths, hunting for its next target. This was not how the war was supposed to go. When Japanese military planners gathered in Tokyo during the autumn of 1941 to finalize their strategy for the Pacific War, they did so with maps spread across long tables, weighted down with ceramic teacups and sliding rulers. They calculated distances, fuel requirements, troop movements. They assessed American industrial capacity and found it wanting in readiness. They examined British colonial defenses and judged them vulnerable. They analyzed Dutch oil reserves in the East Indies and saw sustenance for their war machine. But in all their meticulous planning, in all their strategic assessments and operational forecasts, they made one catastrophic miscalculation. They believed the Americans would fight a gentleman's war. The Imperial Japanese Navy had studied Mahan's theories of naval warfare. They understood battleship engagements, carrier task forces, the decisive battle doctrine that had defined naval thinking since Tsushima. They had built the most powerful battleship the world had ever seen, Yamato, with guns that could hurl shells weighing as much as a small automobile across 25 miles of ocean. They had carriers, destroyers, cruisers, a surface fleet that could challenge any power on Earth. What they hadn't adequately prepared for was an enemy that would ignore the rulebook entirely and wage war from beneath the waves with systematic, relentless efficiency. American submarine doctrine in 1941 was, on paper, defensive and cautious. Pre-war plans called for submarines to scout enemy fleets, to serve as pickets and intelligence gatherers. The notion of unleashing unrestricted submarine warfare against merchant shipping, the very tactic that had brought Germany so close to victory in the First World War and had provoked American entry into that conflict, seemed morally questionable, legally dubious, and strategically uncertain. But on December 7, 1941, as Japanese aircraft reduced Pearl Harbor to burning wreckage, those reservations evaporated like morning mist under a desert sun. Admiral Chester Nimitz, newly appointed commander of the Pacific Fleet, issued orders that would define the submarine campaign: unrestricted warfare against all Japanese shipping. No warnings. No quarter. Every merchant vessel, every tanker, every transport became a legitimate target. The gloves were off, and the Japanese Empire, stretched across 6,000 miles of ocean and entirely dependent on maritime logistics, had just entered a fight it couldn't possibly win. The Japanese called their merchant marine the Maru Fleet, and it was the circulatory system of their empire. Every bullet fired in Burma, every bowl of rice eaten in Manila, every gallon of fuel burned in the skies over Guadalcanal, all of it traveled by sea. Japan produced almost no oil domestically, manufactured limited amounts of rubber and metal, and relied on imported food to feed a military that had swelled to over 6 million men by 1943. The empire they had conquered so swiftly in 1942, from the jungles of New Guinea to the mountains of Burma, depended entirely on ships to sustain it. In December 1941, Japan possessed approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping. Military planners calculated they needed to maintain at least 3 million tons to keep the empire functioning. They estimated losses at roughly 800,000 tons per year based on historical precedents, and assumed they could replace those losses through new construction and captured vessels. It was a reasonable calculation, based on reasonable assumptions, about a reasonable war. But this would not be a reasonable war. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton stood on the bridge of USS Wahoo in January 1943, a cigarette burning between his fingers, watching the Japanese convoy through his binoculars. Morton was not a reasonable man. He was an aggressive, instinct-driven hunter who believed submarines should attack on the surface when possible, who trusted his gut over mathematical probability, and who had already developed a reputation for pressing attacks to suicidal ranges. His executive officer, Richard O'Kane, matched him in aggression and exceeded him in tactical precision. Together, they would transform the Wahoo into the most feared submarine in the Pacific, and their tactics would become the template for American submarine warfare. The convoy consisted of 2 transports escorted by a single destroyer. Standard doctrine called for submerged attacks from long range, firing a spread of torpedoes and then fleeing D before the escorts could respond. Morton surfaced Wahoo in broad daylight, ran past the destroyer at flank speed while the stunned Japanese crew scrambled to their guns, and positioned himself between the merchant ships. He fired torpedoes at point-blank range, so close that his crew could see Japanese sailors abandoning ship before the weapons even struck. Both transports went down within 7 minutes. Morton then pursued the destroyer in a running gun battle that ended only when Wahoo's last torpedo sent the escort vessel to the bottom. This was not naval warfare as the Japanese understood it. This was something feral, unorthodox, and terrifyingly effective. By mid-1943, Japanese merchant captains sailed in perpetual fear. The submarines were everywhere and nowhere, materializing from the deep at the worst possible moments. A tanker carrying aviation fuel from Borneo to Taiwan would vanish without a trace, its disappearance discovered only when it failed to arrive on schedule. A convoy would leave Manila with 12 ships and arrive in Tokyo with 7, the missing vessels marked only by oil slicks and debris fields scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean. The sea routes that had seemed so secure in 1941 had become killing grounds. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese merchant mariners faced mortality rates that exceeded even frontline infantry soldiers. By 1944, the odds of surviving a year at sea had dropped below 50%. Men who had spent their lives on the water, who knew the Pacific as intimately as farmers knew their fields, now went to sea with the grim certainty that they were unlikely to return. Ships sailed without adequate escorts because there weren't enough destroyers to protect both the fleet and the merchant marine. Convoys zigzagged on erratic courses, sailing without lights, maintaining radio silence, and still they died. What made it worse was the invisibility of the enemy. A soldier could see the Americans coming, their bombers, their tanks, their infantry. He could shoot back, take cover, fight, or retreat. But submarine warfare offered no such certainties. The first indication of an attack was often the final indication, a white wake in the water followed by an explosion that would end everything before you could even comprehend what was happening. Survivors spoke of seeing their ships split in half, of watching the bow or stern rise vertically from the water before sliding backward into the deep, of floating in darkness surrounded by burning fuel, knowing that the submarine that had destroyed their vessel was already hunting the next target. The Japanese Navy tried to adapt. They formed convoy systems, though never with the discipline and coordination the Allies achieved in the Atlantic. They equipped merchant ships with defensive armament, though a single-deck gun was useless against a submerged submarine. They developed anti-submarine tactics and trained escort crews, though never in sufficient numbers or with adequate equipment. Every response came too late and fell too short because the scale of the problem exceeded their capacity to solve it. In 1943, American submarines sank approximately 1.5 million tons of Japanese shipping. In 1944, that number rose to 2.7 million tons. By comparison, Japan's shipbuilding industry could produce roughly 700,000 tons of new merchant vessels per year, and that capacity declined steadily as American bombers began targeting shipyards and manufacturing centers. The mathematics were brutal and irrefutable. The Japanese merchant marine was being systematically exterminated, and there was nothing that could stop it. The human cost was staggering. Approximately 116,000 Japanese merchant mariners served during the war. More than 60,000 of them died, a casualty rate of over 50%, higher than any other branch of Japanese service. Each death represented not just a lost life but lost cargo, lost connections, lost capacity to sustain the empire. When a tanker went down with 8,000 tons of crude oil, it meant aircraft grounded for lack of fuel. When a transport carrying replacement troops disappeared, it meant units in the Philippines or Burma fighting at half strength. When a freighter loaded with rice sank, it meant soldiers and civilians went hungry. What the Japanese merchant mariners couldn't understand, what defied their experience and expectations, was the sheer abundance on the other side of the equation. American submarines operated from bases that seemed impossible in their scale and sophistication. At Pearl Harbor, at Fremantle, at Brisbane, submarine tenders serviced boats with an efficiency that bordered on industrial magic. A submarine could return from patrol, depleted of torpedoes, low on fuel, with exhausted crew and damaged equipment, and within 72 hours be fully resupplied, repaired, and ready to return to the hunt. The food was what stunned Japanese prisoners who had been pulled from the water after submarine attacks. They had spent months eating diminishing rations, stretching supplies of rice and fish, occasionally supplementing their diet with whatever could be caught or foraged. Then they found themselves aboard American submarines where the crew ate steak, fresh vegetables, ice cream, where coffee flowed freely and nobody seemed to worry about tomorrow's meal. One captured merchant sailor, interviewed after the war, described watching an American submariner casually discard half a sandwich, more food than he had eaten in a day, because he wasn't particularly hungry. The gesture had haunted him more than the attack itself, because it revealed the fundamental asymmetry of the conflict. The Americans weren't just winning the war. They were winning it while barely tightening their belts, with an industrial base so vast and productive that they could afford to be wasteful. Japanese submarines carried limited supplies and operated on carefully calculated fuel margins. American submarines carried enough provisions for 75-day patrols and still returned with food to spare. The contrast wasn't subtle. It was a chasm that separated two different worlds, two different philosophies, two different visions of what a modern nation could achieve. Lieutenant Shibata Toshiro had been second officer on a transport bringing reinforcements to Truk when USS Tang found them in April 1944. The torpedo struck at dusk, catching the transport broadside and killing half the soldiers packed below deck instantly. Shibata made it into the water with perhaps 100 others. Through the night, that number dwindled as men succumbed to wounds, exhaustion, or sharks drawn by blood in the water. At dawn, Tang surfaced. Shibata expected to be machine-gunned in the water. He had heard the stories, the rumors that American submariners showed no mercy. Instead, sailors appeared on deck with life preservers and rope lines. They pulled survivors aboard, gave them water, treated their wounds. Shibata found himself in the submarine's torpedo room, wrapped in a US Navy blanket, drinking coffee that was inexplicably hot and abundant despite being in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The submarine's crew wasn't cruel or triumphant. They were professional, almost gentle, treating captured Japanese sailors with a courtesy that seemed incomprehensible. When Shibata asked why they had saved them, risking their submarine's position by surfacing in hostile waters, an American sailor shrugged and said something in English that the translator rendered as, "It's what you're supposed to do." The simplicity of that answer troubled Shibata more than anything else he experienced during his captivity. They weren't saving prisoners to extract intelligence or demonstrate superiority. They were doing it because, in their framework of values, letting men drown when you could save them was simply unacceptable. This too was a weapon, though not one the Japanese High Command had prepared for, an enemy that maintained moral standards even in the midst of unrestricted warfare, that could destroy your fleet in the morning and pull you from the water in the afternoon, that operated with a casual assurance that they could afford both the ruthlessness to win and the generosity to show mercy. By 1944, The Japanese Empire was starving, not metaphorically, but literally. Rice imports from Indochina had been cut to a trickle. Oil tankers from the Dutch East Indies arrived in Japan with such irregularity that the Navy began operating at reduced speeds to conserve fuel. Factories shut down for lack of raw materials. The home islands, which had always relied on food imports to supplement domestic production, began experiencing real hunger. Rations dropped, then dropped again. Substitute foods appeared: acorn flour, sawdust mixed with rice, protein supplements made from soybeans and hope. The government exhorted citizens to endure, to tighten their belts, to remember the glory of self-sacrifice. But you cannot eat glory, and sacrifice becomes meaningless when the cause itself has become unsustainable. The military situation mirrored the logistical collapse. Units in Burma, cut off from regular supply shipments, fought with diminishing ammunition and no hope of reinforcement. Garrisons in the Pacific Islands were left to starve or surrender, their supplies exhausted, their connection to the Empire severed by American submarines patrolling the sea lanes. The vaunted combined fleet, once the terror of the Pacific, spent more time in port than at sea because there wasn't enough fuel for training exercises or offensive operations. When Admiral Ozawa took the Japanese carriers into battle at the Philippine Sea in June 1944, he did so knowing his pilots were inadequately trained, his fuel reserves were critical, and his odds of victory were negligible. The result was called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and it marked the effective end of Japanese naval aviation. None of this was accidental. Every shortage, every disruption, every hungry soldier and grounded aircraft traced back to ships that never arrived, to cargo that rested on the ocean floor, to a campaign of submarine warfare that operated with systematic brutality beneath the waves. The Japanese Empire had conquered half of Asia and the Pacific, but empires require logistics, and their logistics were drowning. The American submariners themselves were an unusual breed of warrior. They volunteered for service in vessels that were cramped, dangerous, and operated beyond the reach of immediate support. A submarine crew lived in a steel tube barely 300 feet long, sharing space with torpedoes, diesel engines, batteries that produced hydrogen gas, and enough explosives to reduce the boat to scattered debris if anything went wrong. They operated in waters patrolled by enemy destroyers equipped with depth charges, knowing that if their submarine was detected at depth, their options were limited: evade, pray, or die. Yet they maintained a culture that was surprisingly democratic by military standards. Officers and enlisted men ate the same food, shared the same dangers, and operated with a level of mutual respect that would have been unusual in surface vessels. The efficiency of submarine warfare demanded it. In the tight confines of a submarine, during the tension of an attack or the terror of depth charge attack, rigid hierarchy could get you killed. You needed to trust the man next to you, regardless of his rank, because your survival depended on collective competence rather than individual authority. They also maintained a dark humor that served as psychological defense against the nature of their work. Submarine crews gave their boats nicknames, painted victory flags showing silhouettes of sunken vessels, collected intelligence on the best targets and the most dangerous patrol zones. They joked about Japanese depth charges, calling them ash cans, and rating their accuracy with sardonic commentary. They invented elaborate rituals for successful patrols and developed superstitions about lucky coins, specific foods, or particular crew members. All of it served the same purpose: maintaining sanity and cohesion in a form of warfare that was fundamentally isolating and psychologically brutal. The technology of submarine warfare in World War II existed at a fascinating intersection of the primitive and the sophisticated. American submarines ran on diesel engines at the surface and electric batteries when submerged, switching between the two with procedures that were complex and vulnerable to failure. Their torpedoes were supposed to run straight and detonate on contact, but the Mark 14 torpedo spent the first 2 years of the war failing with such regularity that submarine commanders began filing reports questioning whether they were more danger to the enemy or themselves. The torpedoes ran too deep, or their magnetic exploders fired prematurely, or their contact detonators failed on impact. Submarines would line up perfect shots, fire their torpedoes, hear them strike the target, and watched in helpless fury as the weapons bounced off enemy hulls without exploding. It took until September 1943 for the Bureau of Ordnance to finally admit there were fundamental design flaws in the Mark 14 and implement fixes. By that point, hundreds of attacks had failed due to defective weapons, costing American submarines opportunities and sometimes costing them their lives when targets they should have sunk survived to summon escorts. The institutional resistance to acknowledging the torpedo problem revealed a troubling truth. Military bureaucracies often move slower than wars require, and submariners paid for that inertia in blood and missed opportunities. But once the torpedoes were fixed, once the tactical doctrines were refined, once the intelligence networks began identifying targets with precision, then the American submarine campaign became the most successful commerce-raiding operation in naval history. Individual submarines began racking up absurd numbers of kills. USS Flasher sank over 100,000 tons of shipping. USS Tang destroyed 33 Japanese vessels before being sunk by its own malfunctioning torpedo. USS Silversides conducted 14 war patrols and survived every one of them, sending 23 Japanese ships to the bottom. The symbolism of food became a recurring motif in Japanese accounts of submarine warfare, not dramatic or obvious, but present like background radiation. Prisoners mentioned the coffee, the bread, the casual waste they witnessed aboard American submarines. Survivors spoke of cargo manifests, rice from California, canned goods from Oregon, flour from Kansas, all of it moving across the Pacific in quantities that seemed obscene compared to the scarcity they had endured. The abundance wasn't just material. It represented something ideological, a demonstration that the Americans weren't merely fighting harder but fighting from a position of such fundamental strength that they could afford luxuries even in the midst of total war. Japanese soldiers and sailors had been taught to revere sacrifice, to embrace deprivation as a form of spiritual purification. They believed, because they had been told, that American wealth had made Americans soft, that a nation accustomed to comfort would collapse when faced with real hardship. The submarine campaign demolished that assumption. The Americans weren't soft, they were systematic. They prosecuted submarine warfare with industrial efficiency, maintaining supply lines that stretched across the entire Pacific, coordinating attacks with intelligence networks that seemed omniscient, sustaining a campaign that lasted years without faltering or exhausting itself. When cargo ships went down carrying food supplies, the symbolism cut deeper than simple logistical disruption. It meant civilians going hungry, soldiers weakening from malnutrition, the steady erosion of the empire's ability to feed itself. The Japanese had invaded Southeast Asia partly to secure rice supplies from Indochina and Burma. But what good were rice paddies when the ships carrying their harvest couldn't reach Japan? What value was conquest when you couldn't sustain the basic logistics of empire? By early 1945, the Japanese merchant marine had effectively ceased to exist as a functional entity. Convoys that once numbered dozens of ships now struggled to assemble 5 or 6 vessels. Routes that had carried thousands of tons of cargo daily were abandoned as too dangerous. Tankers remained in port because there was no safe way to bring them home even if they could reach the oil fields. The home islands were cut off, isolated, surviving on stockpiles and domestic production that were wholly inadequate for a nation at war. The military consequences were catastrophic but predictable. The Navy couldn't operate without fuel. The Army couldn't fight without ammunition and reinforcements. The civilian economy couldn't function without raw materials. The entire infrastructure of the Japanese war effort collapsed inward, imploding under the weight of its own logistical impossibilities. When American forces invaded Okinawa in April 1945, the Japanese Navy sent the battleship Yamato on a one-way suicide mission, loaded with just enough fuel to reach the island but not enough to return, a poetic demonstration of how thoroughly submarine warfare had gutted Japanese operational capability. The individual stories of submarine warfare became statistics, and the statistics became history. Over 1,300 Japanese merchant ships totaling 5.3 million tons were sunk by American submarines. Another 214 warships fell to submarine attacks, including a battleship, 8 carriers, and 11 cruisers. American submarine losses were not insignificant. 52 submarines were lost with all hands, representing 22% of the submarine force and accounting for the highest casualty rate of any branch of the American military. But in the brutal calculus of war, the exchange rate was devastatingly in America's favor. There was no single moment when the Japanese recognized the submarine campaign had doomed them. Realizations of that magnitude don't arrive as epiphanies but as accumulations, the slow accumulation of lost ships and failed convoys and supplies that never arrived. Officers in Tokyo would look at logistics reports showing projected shortfalls in oil, rubber, food, metal, and every other commodity an empire needs to survive. They would request reinforcements for garrisons in the Pacific and be told there were no ships available to transport them. They would plan operations that depended on fuel that couldn't be delivered or supplies that rested on the ocean floor. Some understood earlier than others. By mid-1943, more perceptive members of the Naval General Staff had begun warning that the merchant marine situation was unsustainable. They were ignored or dismissed because admitting the problem meant admitting the war was unwinnable, and institutional momentum doesn't allow for such conclusions until they become undeniable. By the time the reality became impossible to ignore, it was far too late to do anything about it. The Pacific War is often remembered for its island campaigns, its carrier battles, its moments of dramatic confrontation. Midway, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, these are the names that echo in historical memory. But beneath all of those battles, sustaining them and making them possible, was the silent war fought under the waves. American submarines didn't win the Pacific War by themselves, but they ensured Japan couldn't win it either. They severed the arteries of empire, strangling the Japanese war effort with patient, relentless efficiency. When the war ended in August 1945, Japanese ports were silent. The harbors that had once bustled with merchant traffic sat empty, filled with sunken vessels and rusting hulks. The ships that remained were largely immobilized, out of fuel, or too damaged to operate. The maritime infrastructure that had sustained the empire lay in ruins, destroyed as thoroughly as the cities that had been firebound or the military that had been defeated. The transformation was total. In 1941, Japan had possessed the third-largest merchant marine in the world. By 1945, it had effectively none. The sea lanes that had connected the home islands to their conquered territories had become graveyards, marked by debris fields and oil slicks stretching across thousands of miles of ocean. The submariners who had prosecuted that campaign returned home to a nation that didn't fully understand what they had accomplished, because submarine warfare operated in silence and secrecy, beneath notice and beyond the awareness of civilian populations. But those who had experienced it understood. The Japanese merchant mariners who survived, the naval officers who had watched logistics reports turn catastrophic, the soldiers who had gone hungry in distant garrisons while waiting for supplies that never came, they understood that the war had been lost not just on battlefields but in the space between ports, in the deep water where American submarines had waged their patient, systematic campaign of destruction. Epilogue. There is a photograph, grainy and faded, taken in Tokyo Bay in September 1945. It shows the USS Segundo, a submarine, surfacing beside the battleship Missouri where the Japanese would sign their surrender. In the background, you can see the mountains of Japan, and if you look carefully at the water, you notice something haunting. The bay is nearly empty of ships. A harbor that should have been crowded with vessels sits quiet, the absence more eloquent than any speech. The emptiness tells the story more completely than any battle report or casualty list. It speaks to the fundamental nature of modern warfare, where victory belongs not to the bravest or most skilled, but to the side that can sustain itself, that can maintain supply lines, replace losses, endure the grinding mathematics of attrition without collapsing. The Japanese Empire had been built on conquest, on the belief that military prowess and spiritual fortitude could overcome material disadvantages. The submarine campaign demonstrated the opposite, that abundance and logistics and industrial capacity were themselves weapons, perhaps the most decisive weapons of all. The American submariners hadn't just sunk ships. They had demonstrated the bankruptcy of an ideology that valued sacrifice over sustainability, that believed spirit could substitute for supply, that imagined empire could be maintained through will alone. The cargo resting on the ocean floor, the rice, the oil, the rubber, the metal, the ordinary material of ordinary logistics, represented something more profound than lost supplies. It represented the impossible dream of empire without foundation, of conquest without the means to sustain it, of war waged beyond the capacity of a nation to endure. In the end, the Japanese mariners weren't stunned just because American submarines had starved their fleet. They were stunned because those submarines revealed a truth their leaders had refused to acknowledge, that Japan had entered a war it could never win, against an enemy whose strength lay not in individual courage or tactical brilliance, but in the boring, prosaic capacity to keep ships at sea, torpedoes in tubes, and food on the table. The abundance they glimpsed aboard American submarines wasn't accidental or incidental. It was the war's central fact, the reason for every outcome, the explanation for why one empire endured while another drowned. The submarines disappeared beneath the waves, hunting in silence, and behind them the Japanese empire dissolved like smoke across water, undone not by a single battle or decisive blow, but by the patient accumulation of losses that could never be replaced, by the mathematics of attrition that could not be overcome, by the simple, devastating reality that empires require sustenance, and theirs had been cut away, ship by ship, convoy by convoy, until nothing remained but surrender and silence and the knowledge that they had been fighting against an opponent they had never truly understood.